I am Dr. Crystal Downing, and I am the co-director, along with my husband, Dr. David Downing, of the Wade Center, and we are extremely excited by tonight's activities. I hope that after this lecture, you will be able to see the ballet, which was inspired by the Great Divorce, that you'll be hearing quite a bit about from David. It's still possible to buy tickets. The box office will be open in Edmund Chapel at 6:15. So I'm hoping if you don't have the tickets, you will get very inspired by what you hear tonight. Then, following the ballet, we will have a reception here at the Wade Center to introduce more people to the importance of what our mission happens to be. So, let me introduce the speaker for tonight. I can say with absolutely no bias that David Downing is the preeminent Lewis scholar in the world. Well, maybe a little bias. So I'll just give you the facts. That's all we want, ma'am, the facts. David was the first person to write a scholarly monograph on C.S. Lewis's space trilogy to be published by University Press, Planets in Peril. He was also the first person to ever explore C.S. Lewis's interest in mysticism. And this, I think, is his best book. He gets emails and notes from people around the world who say that they were ministered to by Lewis's and David's explanation of the importance of drawing closer to Christ. David, now this one I'm not sure about, but I think David may be the first person to have ever written a novel where C.S. Lewis is a character in it. So C.S. Lewis and Tolkien meet a couple of Americans during the 1940s in Oxford, and great conversations and adventures ensue. There was one reader of this novel in Alabama who so loved it that he said, if you're ever in Alabama, come and I'll get you free tickets to a football game. So we haven't done that yet. And then finally, David was one among 3 jillion other people who was asked to write a book on the Narnia Chronicles when the movies came out. So, you have someone very acquainted with C.S. Lewis, and I will let him come and take over now. David.
Thank you so much, Crystal. I dare to just say, and now a man who needs no introduction, so I won't give him an introduction and just sit down. But she very graciously was able to say some great things that I feel good about. I've written a lot of books about Lewis, not necessarily the best, but the first in some cases. I've never written about the Great Divorce, so we'll just wing it a little bit. The Great Divorce is Lewis's theological fantasy, published in 1946. It originally was published in The Guardian, which was an Anglican journal. It was called Who Goes Home in that source, or The Grand Divorce. Who Goes Home in British Parliament, when the session's over, the clerks go through the hallway saying, who goes home? Meaning it's time to leave, we're trying to lock up the building. So you're supposed to get the idea of this is your last chance to get your affairs in order before we lock up the building. His was a question, who goes home? Now they had a friend, a fellow Inkling named Hugo Dyson, who was quite the wit and the wag, and Tolkien said that he thought the whole book should have been called Hugo's Home. He thought that's where he might belong. So, but when it came out as a book, it was called The Great Divorce, not The Grand Divorce. And the title's somewhat puzzling, and I'll explain that here in a second. I think it's one of his best books with one of his most puzzling titles, but if you get the context, you understand what he was talking about. This is the title page in many editions. C.S. Lewis, The Great Divorce, A Dream. Sometimes when I teach this to my students, they say, it was so cool at the end when you find out the whole thing was a dream. You go, yeah, it was kind of cool, and he told you that on the title page as well. So it's a dream fantasy. It's a theological fantasy. And many of the epigraphs say there is no escape. There is no heaven with a little of hell in it. No plan to retain this or that of the devil in our hearts or our pockets. Out Satan must go, every hair and feather. George MacDonald said that. And that's pretty much one of the main themes of the book, is you can't take a little bit of hell with you. When I was growing up, I had 4 brothers, and we were at a conservative Christian home, and we tried to be good Christian boys in general. But one day, my older brother brought home a cigar box, and so we found a pack of playing cards to put in there, and then someone actually found a cigar, and then we found a lighter that was much cooler than matches, and we called that our sin box. So we would be good Christian boys all week, but we knew we had our sin box in the closet. Now, none of us ended up being smokers or gamblers, so I guess our boyhood sin box didn't do us much bad. But a lot of Lewis's question in The Great Divorce is, what is your sin box? You're trying to be a good Christian, but I really need to do that partying on weekends to unwind. Or I'm trying to be a good Christian. Most people deserve forgiveness, but that one person, I just can't forgive her. Sometimes, if you say, well, I don't have a sin box, I would say, congratulations and beware. Because some of the characters in Great Divorce who can't understand why they're not already on the precincts of heaven, the problem is they've rationalized so much, or they're so morally obtuse, they're not even aware what their spiritual problem is. So this is the basic premise. Here's some of the different titles. We see a bus coming from flames. One of them has the light in the dark. The third one is from a famous mural in Mount Sinai. The people are trying to climb a ladder to heaven, and the demons are grabbing them and pulling them off the ladder. So it's a little bit like Chutes and Ladders with higher stakes than the game usually has. It's actually not a very well-chosen title, because the whole point of The Great Divorce is the devils don't pull you down to hell. There's no fire, there's no devils. It's your own choice. In many ways, hell is your own choices. So I don't think that's a great cover. I have no idea what's going on with the 4th cover. Lord of the Rings is a great novel, but that's Tolkien. So don't ask me why there's a ring with the fire and the skylight. He got the premise, the idea for The Great Divorce. It's a theological fantasy. We start out in these dim tenements where it's always twilight and never daytime. He got the idea from a poet named Prudentius, who said, often below the Styx, the river that separates the earth from hell, holidays from their punishments are kept, even by the guilty spirits. Hell grows feeble with mitigated torments, and the shadowy nation, free from fires, exults in the leisure of its prison. The rivers cease to burn with their usual sulfur. Now, this obviously was never theology, but it was sort of theological fantasy that maybe even those in perdition got a chance to experience a little bit of relief. So the idea of the refrigerium was an idea that they got some occasional excursions from their lostness and their suffering. And I just mentioned a couple other places. This idea comes up several times. If you've ever read The Voyage of St. Brendan, which I believe Lewis used as a template for many of the adventures in Voyage of the Dawn Treader, they go out and try to find the island of paradise. And along the way, they have a number of adventures that are very similar to adventures in Voyage of the Dawn Treader. But one of them, they come across this big rock sticking out of the Atlantic Ocean, and there's this man with long hair and a beard who's clinging to the rock, but he's just really enjoying himself. And they go, what are you doing out here in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean clinging to a rock? And he says, well, I'm Judas, and 6 days of the week I have to spend in hell, but one day of the week I get to come up and cool off a little bit. So it's kind of a strained mythology. People still have this compassion for the lost. They still wonder if they could have some mitigations. So Lewis thought he would build a whole fantasy around this sense of what happens in the journey between hell and heaven. The strange title comes from a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell by the poet William Blake. He was a romantic poet, and he wrote a strange document that has a lot of shocking proverbs and poetry to try to get you to think about theological things. He had a very unusual, eccentric theology, which doesn't map onto Christian theology very well, but he certainly makes you think. And Blake wrote in a book called The Marriage of Heaven and Hell, without contraries there is no progression. Attraction and repulsion, reason and energy, love and hate are necessary to human existence. From these contraries spring what the religious call good and evil. Good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active, springing from energy. Now, what would Lewis think of that idea? What the religious call good and evil, good is the passive that obeys reason. Evil is the active, springing from energy. He has other proverbs like the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. The tigers of wrath are wiser than the horses of instruction. This book is very seldom used in Sunday school, and I think you can see why. But Lewis, here's what Lewis's opinion of these ideas. This belief I take to be a disastrous error. He thought that good and evil do not lead into each other. It's not like all roads lead to heaven, or there's a circle and eventually you'll find a spoke that will lead to the center. He felt it was just the opposite. He said choices of good and evil are much more like the branches of a tree or the forking of a road. I do not think all who choose wrong roads perish, but their rescue consists in being put back on the right road. A wrong sum can be put right, but only by going back do you find the error and working it afresh from that point, never by simply going on. Evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good. Time does not heal it. So he's going to call his book The Divorce of Heaven and Hell. You need to be very clear that every decision you make is leading you more heavenward or more hellward. He thought in this book, he thinks of, in fact, he calls hell the dungeon of the self, the dark flame of self-imprisonment. So it's much more about, are you making decisions which make you fall back into the self, or are you making decisions which reach out to others and to God? So he does not envision hell as having flames and devils with pitchforks. It's just this shabby little town. It's like a bad suburb of London, and it's always twilight and it's always raining. Now, interestingly, Lewis is fun to read because you can read the story for its own sake, but he loved Dante's Inferno. And throughout this, if you're going to write about hell, why not bring in a lot of imagery from Dante's Inferno? So all through the book, he's bringing in allusions to Dante and other writers, also Milton. So here we have in the Inferno, you have the vestibule of the Inferno, where it's always raining fire and people can't take shelter. So he's just kind of making an interesting allusion to early on in the Inferno. So he's standing in line. It's very dark. It's a tenement. And he gets into a queue. The British are very serious about their queues. Now, Mark Twain said, heaven for climate, but hell for company. That was his idea. And Lewis wants to prove that's wrong. When you go to the Great Divorce, the first thing you notice is that hell-bound people are just not very pleasant to be around. They're proud and they're conceited and they rationalize their weaknesses. And right away you get the idea that it's just no fun to be in hell. So he's in a queue for a bus. I've always thought it was interesting that it was a bus. Normally this kind of a fantasy, I would expect a stagecoach or a train. He wasn't big on motor vehicles, but it's interesting that he chose a bus. And these people, if they want to, they can get on the bus and take an excursion to heaven. And if they go to heaven, they can even stay there if they want to. So there's no strings attached. It's really up to them. I think maybe, I've always wondered if the reason he chose a bus in this fantasy, this is just speculation, is in Surprised by Joy, one of his key moments of his sense that God was dragging him toward heaven and he was a reluctant convert. But he had this very strange experience as something of himself was falling away and something was opening up to God. And it happened on a bus. He was going from Oxford up Headington Hill toward his home in the Kilns. And I think I've been on that route, and it's very busy and loud and urban when you're leaving Oxford. And suddenly when you get to Headington Hill, you break out into these beautiful woods and you can hear the birds singing, and it's very quiet and natural. He loved nature, and I was wondering if this experience has something to do with breaking out of the city and getting back to nature. But in Surprised by Joy, his memoir, he says, the odd thing is before God closed in on me, I was in fact offered what now appears a moment of wholly free choice. This is exactly what the Great Divorce is all about, is free choices. I was going up Headington Hill on top of a bus. I became aware that I was holding something at bay or shutting something out. I felt myself then and there given a free choice. I could open the door or keep it shut. I knew that to open the door meant the incalculable. So this experience he had in his spiritual journey, he replicates that for many other people. They have that moment of choice, and it's really up to them whether they want to open the door or to stay where they are. The driver of the bus is this very authoritative, no-nonsense figure, and he said in a letter to someone that's another allusion to Dante's Inferno. When they're in the fifth circle of the Inferno, as you recall. It's better in Italian. Does someone give me the Italian? Oh no, Lewis taught himself Italian so that he could, when he was 17, so he could enjoy the Inferno in the original language. And now we have SparkNotes. But in any case, they're stopped at the door of Dis, and they won't let them through. This is Virgil and his guide, Dante and his guide Virgil. And this angel comes along and just sweeps the door away, and it just bursts aside. And so he said the authoritative, no-nonsense driver of the bus was based on this angel in the Inferno. So he's in a queue. He doesn't have to wait very long to get on the bus because people are so quarrelsome that one man hits another and he goes limping off. And then a husband and wife get into an argument and they both go off shouting at each other. So he finds before he even gets on the bus that he's making the way to the front of the line. So the intelligent man he meets is explaining a little bit about the way hell works. And he said it's a huge gray town. It's not beautiful. The houses don't keep the rain out, but it's very expansive. You just think of a house and you've got one. And so it's huge because it's millions and millions of miles across because people don't get along, and as soon as they have a problem, they move out further and out further. He says Napoleon is 2 million miles away. He thought he'd meet all these interesting people in hell. He might meet Mark Twain there, who knows? But he gave the example of Napoleon, and he said he went all the way out to see Napoleon, and Napoleon's just treading around on the carpet saying, oh, it was Ney's fault, it was Josephine's fault, and he's blaming everyone else for the loss of his battles. And that's that spirit that you see throughout these characters in The Great Divorce. He says that you see it's easy here. You've only to think of a house and there it is. That's how the town keeps growing. So they're easy to make, but they don't really keep out the rain, so they're somewhat phantasmal. But once again, he's alluding to pandemonium. When Satan and his devils get thrown into hell, they think up a palace and there it is. But once again, it has no functional value. The word pandemonium, it comes from Milton. It's the place of all devils. And one of the first person he meets is the Episcopal ghost. Actually, I wanted to mention earlier, when he's on the bus, even on the bus, he starts meeting characters who have a lot of problems. He meets a tousle-headed poet who's very upset that no one has recognized his genius, and he blames everyone else. And so at one point, he actually pulls out a sheaf of papers to prove that he's a poet of genius, and he wants to hand it to the narrator, who's Lewis, and Lewis quickly changes the subject. And as an English professor, I can tell you that is a good image of hell, is having a young poet who say, please read my book manuscript and tell me how good it is. So that was a good metaphor for English professors. But the tousle-headed poet was, his wealthy parents didn't support him enough and they didn't understand his genius. And then the 5 schools that he was kicked out of, none of them understood him. And then the critics did not understand him. He even mentions one particular critic by name who ruined his reputation. I think Lewis has someone in mind. He had a very difficult student who thought of himself as a great poet, but I won't mention that name. But I think he got the idea of this hellish journey on the bus with the young Touselhead. He finally says, I was so discouraged I threw myself under a train and then I woke up in this gray town. He doesn't even realize that he committed suicide, and this is the version of hell that he's experiencing. So he meets a tousle-headed poet. When he gets off, he meets an Episcopal ghost who's very well-spoken, and one of his former students or former colleagues who had been a fellow liberal has now decided to embrace true Christianity, historic Christianity, what Lewis liked to call deep Christianity. He said it's not so much about high church or low church, it's about deep church. Who are the people that are really connected to the supernaturalism of the whole Christian tradition? So the Episcopal ghost is talking to a colleague who's decided that he really did want to take these spiritual realities seriously. But the humor is that he's in hell moving toward heaven, and he still doesn't get it. He wants to discuss what the metaphors mean. So it's a comic passage. Crystal and I did it a few weeks ago, and Crystal, I think, carried the house with her Episcopal ghost. Is that on YouTube? Oh, it's not on YouTube. Okay. In any case, the Episcopal ghost, the his colleague says, will you come with me to the mountains? As the bus leaves, it goes up this huge Grand Canyon-like crevice, and then it lands in this beautiful foothills of the high country. And suddenly it's bright and beautiful, the birds are singing. It's very bright light, it's almost too bright for the ghost. When they get to that area, they're very phantasmal and apparitional. You can see they have no solidity. And they're also very dark, whereas the people who come to meet them from the high country are very solid and very bright. So this gentleman comes and says, will you come with me to the mountains? Well, that's a plan. I am perfectly ready to consider it. Crystal, go ahead and do you? I am perfectly ready to consider it. Of course, I should require some assurances. I should want to guarantee that you are taking me to a place where I shall find a wider sphere of usefulness and scope for the talents that God has given me, and an atmosphere of free inquiry. In short, all that one means by civilization and the spiritual life. No, said the other, I can promise you none of these things. No sphere of usefulness. You're not needed there at all. No scope for your talents, only forgiveness for having perverted them. No atmosphere of inquiry, for I will bring you not to the land of questions, but of answers, and you shall see the face of God. And it goes on in that tone, and the Episcopal ghost never does figure out that this is a spiritual reality. He's arrived at the afterlife. And so, once again, I think there may be a model for the Episcopal ghost. There was a famous Reverend E.W. Barnes, who was a liberal thinker, who said, we don't need to take the gospel seriously in terms of miracles and supernaturalism. Let's just focus on the moral teachings. This is a very common modernist attempt to accommodate Christianity to more skeptical souls. But for Lewis, that's also a disastrous error. So there's a controversial free thinker, and his reward for all of his eccentric thoughts and his heretical thoughts was to become the Bishop of Birmingham. So in the Anglican Church, it was quite liberal. In the next generation, he had some things. Do you remember Honest to God by John Robinson? He was also became a bishop. Somebody asked Lewis what he thought of Honest to God, and Lewis said, I just wish he'd been honest. And I think he feels the same way about E.W. Barnes. So they get to paradise, it's beautiful, but for many reasons, people don't want to stay there. Some of them never get off the bus. They're terrified to go into this bright, well-lit region where they're just phantoms. One of them, they find a tree with golden apples, which is a very common image of paradise. You find that in Greek mythology, you find it in Tirnanog in Irish mythology. But his idea, rather than to enjoy paradise, he sees one of these golden apples on the ground, and he says, boy, if I could grab that and take it back to where I'd be well off. And so he spends the whole time lugging this apple. It's too heavy to lift. He's breaking his back, and so he's just getting it inch by inch. And Lewis says at the end, a waterfall, who's a kind of angelic spirit, says, put it down. You don't need to possess anything here. You're being possessed by your possessions. But the man never listens to it, and he keeps working on this apple. He could just barely lift it. And the last you see him, Lewis says, that's the last I saw of him, carrying his torture, which I thought was a wonderful image of his greed becoming his burden. What he thinks is his bounty is his burden. About halfway through the novel, George MacDonald shows up. Lewis loved the Scottish poet and novelist and preacher who was very influential in his life. When he was still a skeptic as a teenager, he read Fantastes, and he said, it baptized my imagination. That gave me a sense of what goodness was like. And even though he didn't become a Christian until his early 30s, he said that every book I've written has some of George MacDonald in it. At one point, he said, I read George MacDonald almost as devotional literature. So in the Inferno, Dante, the poet, is taken through the Inferno by Virgil, the poet. And then when he gets to the Purgatorio and the Paradiso, Beatrice, this lovely young woman who's spiritually pure, it becomes his guide. And so for George MacDonald, this is not a lovely young woman, but he says the stand-in for Beatrice in the Great Divorce. Lewis did an anthology of some of his favorite sayings from George MacDonald, and he mentioned both heaven and hell. And you can see that Lewis is very much in the spirit of MacDonald. For the only heir of the soul is the present God and the spirits of the just. That is our heaven, our home. We shall be God's children on the little hills and in the fields of heaven, not one desiring to be before the other. For ambition and hatred will then be seen to be one and the same spirit. And then he says about hell, the one principle of hell is, I am my own. And that's certainly one of the themes that we see over and over again in these characters. There are 20 speaking characters who have a chance to get off the bus and to stay in heaven. And I think one makes it. So generally, Milton also said, better to reign in hell than to serve in heaven. So that attitude of, I need to be the sovereign of my own life, that's kind of the hellish attitude that Lewis is trying to expose. So MacDonald leads him through the middle part of the book. And MacDonald pretty much gives the nub of the matter from George MacDonald. If somebody asks you, what is the Great Divorce about? I think there's one sentence that MacDonald says to Lewis, the character, which pretty much gives you the kernel of the book. But what of the poor ghosts who never get into the omnibus at all? Everyone who wishes it does. Never fear, there are only two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says in the end, thy will be done. All that are in hell choose it. Without that self-choice, there could be no hell. No soul that seriously and constantly desires joy will ever miss it. Those who seek, find. To those who knock is opened. So that one thing about, there are two kinds of people in the end. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those who God says, well, thy will be done. That he always, MacDonald always stressed our freedom of choice. And Lewis picked up that theme very strongly in Great Divorce. One of the more memorable characters is a ghost who gets off the bus, and he's got this red lizard on his shoulder. And he's saying, and the lizard is whispering in his ear these little ribald remarks and things. They're kind of chuckling, but he wants to get rid of the red lizard. And he says, oh, I've got to go back. I can't stay here. This poor fellow's not behaving. He's saying all kinds of things that you can't say in this atmosphere. And the angel comes up to him, the bright spirit, and says, oh, well, I can take care of that. Oh, you can? Oh, that's good. I would really like something done about this lizard. Well, I'm going to have to reach out and kill it. Oh, no, not that so far. I'm sure I can talk to him about it. And the lizard says, he means it, he'll kill you. Be careful. I mean, he'll kill me. Don't let him get close to us. And so this poor young man is really torn between the lizard, who's pleading for its life and saying, he's trying to fool you. You need me. You know you can't get along without me. And the angel was saying, I need to take care of that lizard. And as he comes close with his burning hands, the young man says, ow, that burns, that hurts. And the angel says, I didn't say it wouldn't hurt. I said I wouldn't kill you. So finally, after much hemming and hawing, he agrees to allow the angel to kill the lizard. And so he removes it from his shoulder and breaks its back. And it lies there wriggling in the grass for a second. But then instead of dying, it slowly starts transforming itself from an ugly little lizard into a big, beautiful stallion. Now, as the first scene, we saw the lizard riding on the man's shoulder. He's clearly controlling the man. He seems to be the one, as I say, he's the rider. But once it turns into a beautiful stallion, the man gets on the back and rides up to the highlands of heaven. Lewis had this fascinating image of heaven often as we're only in the foothills, and we're always trying to go further up and further in, as we see in Narnia. It's one of his favorite images of heaven as the high country. So this one fellow we know ended up in the right direction. In a way, it's not surprising. Lewis often felt that sins of the flesh. He seems to represent lust, what he calls an unappeasable lust. I think it could be any addictive behavior. But Lewis wasn't surprised. He said in Mere Christianity that sometimes a self-righteous prig is worse off than a prostitute. He says you don't want to be either, but sometimes sins of the spirit are worse than sins of the flesh and harder to get rid of. That's why I said earlier about the sin box. Sometimes the sins of the spirit are the ones that you don't even know need to be taken care of. So that's a very dramatic scene. Another dramatic scene is he comes upon in this beautiful paradisal country this goddess figure who is so large and surrounded by her children and surrounded by animals. She's like a female St. Francis of Assisi. She's totally attuned with nature. And he just wonders, is this an angel? Is this an archangel? Who is this beautiful goddess-like figure? And George MacDonald explains, well, actually, she was a charwoman in London. She was just a cleaning lady. In earthly terms, people didn't take much account of her, but in heaven, she was one of the great warriors for the kingdom. And so this woman who was not much recognized on earth is actually a very beautiful and majestic spirit in heaven. And let's see, I just wanted to mention there is a precedent for that. Lewis loved the figure of Matilda in the Purgatorio. She's this saintly woman who's very much in touch with nature and helping Dante to adjust to getting ready to go to paradise. So Sarah Smith, I don't have a picture of this because it would be hard to Google this, but she meets this fellow. It looks like a kind of gangly tragedian or vaudeville figure. I kind of get this image of Charlie Chaplin, and he's dragging behind him some kind of a smaller figure that looks like an organ grinder's monkey or something, and he starts talking to her, and as Lewis, the character, watches them interact, he suddenly realizes that the tragedian, the actor, is actually a mannequin or a puppet of some kind, and the figure in back is what's controlling him. The figure in back is a dwarf. And so, and the dwarf loves to play the victim. Oh, you never loved me, you never understood me, nobody realized. And he says at one point, what are we even made for? And she says, we're made for infinite joy. And so she's trying to help him break away from this projection. I see it as kind of an ego projection, or some people wanting to put up a social front that they can't sustain, but he never can really let go and take himself less seriously. He needs to be, they shouldn't say drama queens, because plenty of males have this trait, right? He's basically a drama king. He wants to melodramatize all his problems, and it's all everybody else's fault. And he comes some close for one moment. She's so beautiful and so majestic, and she was his former wife, and she so invites him to just put all that behind, drop the tragedian, and go with her into the highlands of heaven. And he says, I've never seen someone fight against joy like that. Part of him really wants joy and wants to be freed of all this. But another part of him is his ego is just so anchored in his personality. He finally decides he just doesn't want to do it. And he just starts getting smaller and smaller and smaller. And this is one of the interesting metaphors in the whole narrative. We would expect the people in heaven to be bright and radiant, and we would expect the other figures to be kind of dark and smoke-like. But he also adds that they're much more solid. He calls them the bright people, but he also calls them the solid people. And this is why this poor phantom who wanted the apple, he had no chance of actually bringing it about, because the apple is so solid and so concrete. And George MacDonald says to the Lewis character, that's why it's so hard to talk about hell. It's so nearly nothing. You know, God is the most concrete object in the world, and as you get farther away from God, your essence just begins to fade. Your spiritual essence moves toward non-entity. And so this poor dwarf basically disappears because he wants to cling to his egoistic self-drama rather than go with his former wife. They have a passage, once again, George MacDonald is talking about what happens to those who never got the gospel when they were on earth. There's an old tradition going all the way back to Scripture, whatever that means, when it talks about Christ went to heaven and preached to those who were disobedient in the time of Noah in 1 Peter. And
No, he didn't go to heaven.
oh, okay. Sorry, she pointed down. I thought I was supposed to kneel. I'm sorry, I said heaven, hell. Yeah, so he preached to those who were disobedient. And there's also about leading the captives from captivity. And some people, especially Roman Catholics, believe that they have a doctrine called the harrowing of hell, that in those 3 days between the crucifixion and the resurrection, Christ went and preached to those in prison and made it very clear what earth was about, what heaven and hell were about, what it was like to be with God, what it was like to be apart from God. And some choose to go with him at that point, and others still want to stay in hell, even when they have the full revelation. This is not official doctrine. It's another one of those speculations. People who worry about the noble heathen or the righteous heathen, sometimes they take comfort in the idea that everyone will get a glimpse of the gospel. They will understand what the stakes are. But the human ego and human pride and arrogance being what it is, some people would rather be alone with their pride than to be humble with God. Just a quick digression. When I was in graduate school, I rented a room from a woman who was in very bad health, and but also very well-to-do. And her family members would only visit her occasionally because she was not that pleasant to be around. And so I heard her, sometimes I would play the butler and bring in drinks and appetizers and things. And she would be, for about 30 seconds, oh, thanks for coming to visit me. Would you like some tea? why don't you come more often? I think you're just after my money. You don't even care about me. And these little kids are kind of sitting there like 6 and 8. So I tried to tutor her on, well, when they come, you have to give them positive reinforcement. You have to say, how are the kids? What are they doing in school? Did you go on vacation together? Oh, I'm glad you like swimming. And I said, you need to make them feel that you care about them and it's a positive. And every time I tutored her, she would last for about another 30 seconds. So like the 5th time she had a visit from family, she was nice and then she said, well, why don't you come visit me more often? You're just after my money. And I remember thinking, finally they would start calling me on my own phone and say, how's she doing? Tell her we're thinking about her. How's her health? And I'm supposed to go report to her and say, oh, they called. And she says, don't worry, I'm on to them. But it was really strange to me that she would rather be spiteful and resentful and alone than to really embrace them and swallow her pride and really take an interest in them. And I remember thinking of her, I said, this would make a great scene in The Great Divorce. Because without seeing it in real life, you would say, well, everybody wants belonging and community and family and love and acceptance. But she didn't want that as much as she wanted to punish them for not coming to see her more often. So if I were going to add a chapter to The Great Divorce, that would be my chapter. I think most of us read The Great Divorce and say, oh, I know someone like that. I know the person who's so greedy that. But you're supposed to think, am I like that? We're supposed to be thinking about our own sin boxes. We're not supposed to be thinking about other people's sin boxes. So toward the end, after we've met a number of these characters, there are about 20 of them. There's a conspiracy theorist who thinks it's all about the Catholics and the Vatican and the Jews and the demagogues and the dictators, and he's quite sure that everything is rigged against him. At one point he says to the solid person, I don't want any bleeding charity. And the other person says, that's exactly what you'd ask for, bleeding charity. That's exactly what you need. But once again, the first time, I've seen articles that say that he hits all the 7 deadly sins, but I don't think he tries to do that. I think he's trying to say over and over again, pride, arrogance, self-rationalization, egocentrism. That seems to be the big obstacle. As they get back on the bus and decide to go back to hell, they remembered coming up through this wonderful, huge canyon going up to heaven. Finally, when they talk about going back, George MacDonald says, well, actually, I think you came out of that crack right there. And they don't realize that this big, huge canyon was just one little crack in the floor of heaven. And so apart from brightness versus darkness and solidity versus being phantasmal, there's an issue of size. They don't realize how small this huge city, which they thought was millions of miles across in hell, it all fit into one little crack in the floor of heaven. So it's a beautiful closing image to the story, that they didn't realize their own pettiness, their own smallness the whole time they were in heaven. And then he wakes up at the end, and my students all go, oh, it was only a dream. I go, that's the title page. Okay, so that's my general survey of what you'll be seeing in the ballet. Any questions?
We'd like to have you ask questions on the microphone because we are recording this. So if you need any more clarification, especially if you are going to the ballet where they did create a bus for the stage. You'll see one character tethered to another, the tragedian with the dwarf. It's just fascinating to think of how C.S. Lewis, who is so brilliant with words, can be turned into the brilliance of artistry of dance. So I hope you're able to attend.
And Crystal will be Sarah Smith of Golders Green. She will be the woman who's become a goddess in heaven.
So I just saw the screw tape letters, and so I'm thinking connections between how Lewis saw evil of the demons who are tempting the people, but then there's also the choices made that people are choosing not to follow life. And so can you comment a little bit on how you see those connections in Lewis's writing?
That's a good question, because in many ways they're very opposite. Some people talk about Lewis's infernal period. Right during the World War II, he had a lot of images of spiritual warfare that were very vivid and specific. In Paralandra in 1942, this character, Weston, gets demon-possessed for most of the novel, and it feels like a real description of demon possession. And then in Screwtape Letters, the senior tempter is telling the junior tempter what human foibles are, and here's how you can trip them up in their Christian walk. But this is different because people think he was almost becoming obsessed with devils and temptations. He did believe in devils, and he did believe they could plant thoughts into your mind. But this has almost the opposite impression. It's all about people's own choices. There's no devils, there's no hell, there's no torture. And I think even in Screwtape Letters, you're supposed to realize that the whispering of devils is a trope for the ways we trick ourselves. I'm not saying it's totally metaphorical, but it's really about human nature. In Screwtape Letters, I saw that production, which was brilliant, the Fellowship for Performing Arts. But he's talking about just subtle psychological things that keep you from God. There's one scene where someone's sitting in the British Library, British Museum, reading all these Christian books and thinking there could be these wonderful spiritual realities. There could be real spiritual warfare that I don't see going on. And then the devil says, well, look up, and there's the newsboy, and there's the number 82 bus, and reality's not that dramatic. It's not that supernatural. So he thought just to plant the idea that reality is what you see right in front of your face rather than unseen spiritual realities. It's really talking about psychological tricks we play on ourselves. What I think's humorous about that scene I just mentioned, he just made up a bus number. Oh, you see the number 82 bus going by outside the British Museum. And everybody, instead of reading it and going, wow, that's really profound, how often do our physical senses make us think there's nothing else going on unless it's right in front of us? But they all wrote Lewis and said, there's no 82 bus outside the British Museum. What are you talking about, So he got dozens of letters, so be careful if you write fiction to make sure that you get the details straight. That's what people tend to notice. That is a good question, though, because Screwtape Letters is almost the opposite of the Great Divorce in terms of a sense that it's really about us and our choices. The whole devil made me do it idea doesn't go very far with Lewis's Christian theology.
I am interested in your idea of the spiritual solidity, because especially since that seems present in Out of the Silent Planet as well. And I'm kind of wondering if you think Lewis was toying with that idea as early as Spirits in Bondage with the poem, I think it's called In Praise of Solid People. I mean, and if so, like what role that idea of spiritual solidity might have had in his path towards theism and Christianity?
That's another good question. Am I getting paid to do this? These are good questions. He wrote Spirits in Bondage before he was a Christian. He had a long spiritual journey. He lost his faith in his early teens and didn't get it back until his early 30s, thanks in part to Tolkien and other Christian friends. In Praise of Solid People, he had a very vexed relationship with his father and the sort of well-to-do bourgeois of Northern Ireland. And my take on that poem is his mixed feelings. He's an intellectual, he's tormented, he wants to be a poet. He is a poet because he wrote Spirits in Bondage. Thomas Mann, who's another artist, he talks about the tension between Geist and Leben, spirit and life. And he says that when this young man goes and hangs about his family, they're so bland and they have very conventional opinions and they're very confident in their kind of middle class ways. They don't really ask the hard questions. So he leaves behind Laban, real life, and he goes to spend time with the artistic community. And they're so insightful and they're so dazzling, but they're so neurotic and they're so egocentric and they argue among themselves. And he gets tired of the artist, so he goes back to his family. But there's a strange tension between Geist and Laban and Thomas Mann. And I think In Praise of Solid People is that same mixed feelings between, well, bless their hearts, they work hard and they bring home money and they live in nice houses, but they're really kind of obtuse about spiritual things. But he kind of envied that. He almost wished he could be one of the solid people. I think he meant it that way in terms of, in that poem, I think solid means people of means, people who are financially solid and comfortable. You're quite right, though, that this idea fascinated him. And Out of the Silent Planet, in medieval cosmology, God is the most concrete thing in the universe. And everything as you move away from God is less concrete than he is until you get to hell, which is almost non-existence. And in Out of the Silent Planet, they see these Eldila, these angels, and they just look like these footsteps of light. But later, one of the creatures of Malacandra or Mars explains to him that, well, actually, they're not ephemeral or evanescent, it's us. To them, to angels, the physical universe it's like walking through a cloud. They have no trouble walking through walls or walking through rocks, because according to their solidity, we're barely even here. So he loved that idea, and he definitely used it even much more explicitly in Great Divorce than he did in Out of the Silent Planet. That's a great connection, though.
Thank you so much, David, for your talk. Really appreciated it. So you mentioned that only one person gets in to heaven. One person makes the choice. Why do you think that is? Why do you think Lewis gave us 20 examples of people making the wrong choice and one example of somebody making the right choice?
That is another good question. Could somebody just say, what year was it published? 1946. My students sometimes ask me that, and they say, well, that's kind of cynical. All these people come and they're also selfish and arrogant and self-centered. And my answer is that their starting place is hell. They're not getting on in a bus in London. And so we're not people who are in the middle of their spiritual journey. These are people who have made so many bad choices in their life that they're already in the gray city down below. Lewis has a theory that he talks about in the Mere Christianity, is that we all have a spiritual center of gravity. And so you're doing okay, you make a good choice. Even like when you're dieting, you pass on dessert one time, it's a little easier to pass on dessert. This is hypothetical for me, I don't know if it actually works or not. But every time you make a good choice, your moral center of gravity kind of tilts in that direction and it becomes easier and easier. And eventually that discipline becomes a habit. But if you're in making the wrong choices, your center of gravity kind of goes downward. If you have addictive behavior, I'm not going to do that anymore, and then you do it. And the next time it's even harder to resist. And eventually your whole center of gravity is pointing downward. And it's very hard at that point to make good moral choices because so much of your moral nature has become habituated to the wrong choices. So I think my answer would be their starting point is hell. Their moral center of gravity is already pointing downward. So it's going to be that much harder for them to really leave all those bad choices behind and really join God and the solid people. I do think it's interesting that the man who's struggling with lust is the one who seems to break away from his old habits more than the others, who most of them have sins of the spirit to deal with. And many of them don't even know they have a problem. They're sure it's everyone else's problem, not theirs. Good.
Going back to the 82 bus, it strikes me that it would be natural for someone writing in 1946 to use some of the context around him of World War II and where England had been at that time. But what you described is all about classical literature as a context. So I'm wondering, is there really no contemporary context that's part of the story, or you just didn't mention it? They're in a tenement, they're in kind of a bad part of town, which looks a lot like London. He didn't like big cities. So I think he's using kind of bad parts of London as part of the imagery. The bus is definitely part of the imagery. When they get to heaven, it's almost all nature. Lewis was very Wordsworthian. He didn't like cities. He tended to like trains because he'd been used to those since boyhood. But I would just say the imagery has to do more with city versus country. Even the bus, we don't see much about it once we get up there. So I'm trying to think of more contemporary imagery. I'm reading Mere Christianity right now, and I'm struck how much the war is burdening his heart while he was writing that book. He says, we're in occupied territory. We're like an underground. When we go to church, we're exchanging secret messages. So his immediate imagery is of people in occupied territory, like the poor French and the Danes and others like that. And another place he says, when you land it on a beachhead, one of the hardest things to do in war is a seaborne assault where you bring the soldiers in from the ocean. And in Normandy, it went really well. The assault turned into being able to liberate the whole country. In Italy, it didn't go so well. They landed at a place called Anzio and got stuck on the beach for 6 months without going more than, because they were just pinned in by the German forces. And he has this metaphor that's saying, you know, when the Spirit comes into your life, he makes a beachhead into your personality and your spirit. And some people, once that beachhead is established, they start laying down their arms. And soon more and more of their life is liberated and given over to God and given over to their own joy. Whereas other people, they're Christians, the Spirit's landed, but they are going to put up this fierce resistance. They still need their pride and their pleasures and their egoistic fantasies. And he made that analogy that some of us sort of had the Spirit pinned down on the beaches. And once again, I'm sure that metaphor came out of the war news. He was giving the broadcast talks during the war. As a matter of fact, the building that he was giving them from was bombed at one point and had several floors blown out. And one of them was during a broadcast. Can you imagine, say, coming to you from the BBC, and all of a sudden, boy, those are great sound effects. That's really, so people forget that he was actually putting himself in physical danger by going to London during the London Blitz. So I'm sort of going around your question. I don't see a lot of contemporary imagery in Great Divorce, but if you go to some of his other books, I'm really struck by how much war imagery is a part of his concept of spiritual warfare. Let's go around and say, what is your sin box? I think that would be edifying to just go through. You want to do that? You want to start? Crystal, do you want to start?
Well, I'm going to dumb it down by asking this question. When the red lizard turns into the white horse, what does that truly mean? Because at first I thought it was an earlier reference where evil can be undone, but it cannot develop into good.
Right.
So I'm confused.
Well, I think he's thinking specifically of the misuse of a good gift versus the proper use of a good gift. If you're an alcoholic, this is something you need to get rid of, and you probably are not going to be able to just say, well, just make it behave. You're probably going to have to give it up entirely, but alcohol can be properly used. I think the most apt imagery for the lizard turning into the stallion is lust. In fact, later on, George MacDonald calls it an unappeasable lust. So if you want gratification, but you're looking at pornography and you're partying on weekends, that kind of attempt to fulfill your sexual instincts is just going to be grinding on the spirit. That just can't be taking you to a good place. But if you really learned how to take the sexual instinct and to kill the egoistic part or the personal part, and it becomes a part of a wholesome marriage, then suddenly what had been a real problem for that person becomes a beautiful thing. So now we're in a relationship, we're bearing children, and so what had seemed to be a real problem for that person suddenly turns into one of the greatest blessings of that person's life. So I think that would be the most obvious interpretation of the lizard episode turning into a stallion.
Just to answer that lady's question, this is in the book on page 114. And George MacDonald is talking, and he says, lust is poor, weak, whispering thing compared with the richness and energy of desire which will arise when lust has been killed.
Oh, okay, good. I need Jerry Root here. He's so good at remembering the exact
Well,
words.
and considering George MacDonald had 11 children, he knew what he was talking about.
So if this were a pop quiz, though, would I have gotten that answer right? Was that close enough to? Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, I want to make sure I get my point there. Any other questions? Well, Crystal, remind us again what the next events are. I'm really excited about seeing the ballet. It's such a verbally rich book. To see it translated into music and dance and lighting, I'm fascinated to see what this is going to be like.
Tickets, if you don't have one, go on sale at 6:15 in Edmond. And then at 6:30 is a conversation where the director choreographer of Ballet 5/8, which is a troupe made up entirely of Christians who are dedicated to the excellence of their craft. It reminds me of Dorothy Sayers' famous statement that the only Christian work is good work well done. And they the artistic director and another one of the leaders of Ballet 5.8 will be talking about what inspired them, of all things, to select The Great Divorce to turn into a ballet. I will be up there talking a little bit more about C.S. Lewis, things that David hasn't mentioned this evening. So that starts, it's called Grace Notes, that starts at 6:30, and then the actual ballet starts at 7:30. Then following the ballet, you can come back here for refreshments.
Did you ever explain, does everybody know why it's called Ballet 5.8?
Explain.
Well, if you get out your Bible and look out chapter 5 and verse 8 of every book, you'll eventually get to Romans. Nobody explained it to me. I was looking through Leviticus and Deuteronomy, and I wasn't being edified. But when you get to Romans 5:8, he says that this shows God's love for us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. So they take that as their life verse for the dance company.
And this is something that we're really committed to at the Wade, not only archiving these great works of creativity in the past, but encouraging people to be inspired by Lewis and Tolkien and Sayers and all our 7 authors to create new works of creativity, especially in this day and age where logical apologetics isn't reaching people. But just as C.S. Lewis was baptized through his imagination, how might we baptize others through their imaginations?
Good.
Thank you for coming. Hope to see you at the ballet.
Thanks for coming. Good to come.